Welcome to the Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Ever since we began this podcast, we've featured an episode in May for Mental Health Awareness Month. And given the current state of the world, it feels the topic is more important than ever. Today, I'm going to push myself out of my comfort zone in a solo episode, and I hope you will all bear with me. I've shared glimpses into my own mental health journey within different podcast conversations and from time to time on social media, but it feels a lot more vulnerable to do it in this way. And if I'm being honest, that is a big reason why I am deciding to record a solo episode. We often say or hear people say it's okay not to be okay. But that phrase can only become a reality if we get more comfortable being uncomfortable, whether that's having the courage to be vulnerable with our struggles and stories, or whether that's in making the effort to create a safe space to listen and learn from those who share. This month has been a very hard one for me. And last week I had a call with our Standout 50 leadership community where I felt unable to fake it in opening up to them about my not being okay. I was received with kindness, grace, empathy, and support. It meant more to me than I can say, and also gave me the courage to record this episode. I grew up with a lot of instability and a good dose of emotional neglect. And as a result, I have complex PTSD. That presents itself in manners such as challenges regulating my nervous system, bouts of depression, anxiety, and more. I was also diagnosed with PTSD after my 3-year-old son's type 1 diabetes diagnosis in 2019 and formally diagnosed with ADHD in 2021. So that's about a bit of background. And then 2 weeks ago, a dear loved one who has been a huge part of our lives since Evan's diagnosis and is also like a mom to me was hospitalized with seizures. And last week we found out she has glioblastoma, which is terminal brain cancer. I don't share any of this for pity, simply to give some context to what I want to say within this episode, to let those that might be listening understand that throughout my 44 years, I have struggled at different times in different ways with my mental health. And this month in particular has been a very, very challenging one in that regard. It's also important, I think, to share this because it's a good reminder for all of us that more often than not, the individuals we see every day performing at work, showing up on social media, getting things done, have realities that they are contending with behind the scenes that we don't know anything about. So, up to this point, when we've done mental health awareness episodes, I have sought mental health awareness experts or thought leaders to feature for those episodes, and this episode will look a bit different. I am not an expert by any means beyond my own personal experience, but I figure in some ways, what better expertise could there be? I realized also that while I've welcomed those guests because I truly value their perspective and their knowledge, it's also been simply easier to hide behind someone else's story than to share my own. What I want to share today is all based on my own personal experiences and observations. These are just things that I feel compelled to share, knowing that May is Mental Health Awareness Month. I've broken them into two categories, one sort of person-to-person reflections and one more geared toward things that leaders or organizations might benefit from keeping in mind. So first, I would like to talk about the fact that vulnerability is not easy on either side. While we talk or hear often about the value of being vulnerable, this is a characteristic that is often mentioned as a strength from a leadership perspective. It's one of those things that is far easier said than done. The reality is that being vulnerable can be really uncomfortable for a number of reasons. when you are the one being vulnerable, the reality is it's not a widely practiced skill, at least not genuinely. You might fear being viewed as less capable. You aren't sure how others will react. You may even fear repercussions when sometimes you just want the space to share your truth, but you're not sure how that will be received by those around you. One personal note is I've found that when I'm having a hard time with something and I just need to be heard, it is helpful to set that expectation. So to say up front, I would like to share something with you. I am just looking for the space to be vulnerable about what I'm going through. I don't expect you to take action. Of course, when you do need something more than to be heard, it is also important to set that expectation as well. So while being vulnerable can be very uncomfortable, so too can receiving someone else's vulnerability. This is also not widely practiced. This is largely because it is human nature to want to fix or help instead of sitting back and listening or sitting with someone, holding space for them in a hard moment. Those instincts kick in, and we naturally feel we need to offer a solution, support, perhaps beyond our abilities or our place, or solve that person's challenges. We really, truly undervalue the impact of just listening, holding space for someone who is having a hard time to share what's on their minds, on their hearts, and letting them know that you care and that they are seen. While vulnerability can be really uncomfortable, I've also found it to be freeing. And I would be remiss not to own the reality that there is certainly privilege in being able to say that. It's freeing because of the second point I would like to share, which is that masking or covering up a struggle, a neurodivergence, a mental health condition, even something as simple as a really rough night or a bad day, takes a tremendous amount of energy. It can be truly exhausting to have to pretend you're okay when you aren't. Therefore, environments and people that provide the psychological safety to be vulnerable play a huge part in taking that weight off and giving someone some breathing room from whatever it is that they're having a hard time with. The third point that I'd like to share is that people who are struggling with their mental health are the least likely and the least equipped to ask for help. I feel this is such an important truth to emphasize because when I hear someone say, I wish they would just have asked for help, I know as someone who has struggled that the person making that statement certainly never has. Otherwise, they would know how unrealistic that really and truly can be. This, of course, makes things tricky for leaders and team members and organizations because the issue would be far simpler if it were realistic for individuals to just ask for help when they need it. However, sometimes the polar opposite can actually be true, which is my fourth point. I've learned from personal experience that overfunctioning can look like being the master of getting things done, juggling it all, being a superhuman, but is often hiding a lot, which is why we see burnout and people who look like they had it all together, in quotes, crumbling. This has been one of my biggest lessons of the last couple of years and one that is still unfolding. And it's a reason that true and genuine intent and action to promote work-life balance is crucial. Next up, I want to talk about crying at work. I'm infamous for my posts on LinkedIn to normalize crying at work because I believe deeply that displaying emotions at work within limits that aren't truly disruptive should be not only normalized but embraced. Individuals who care deeply at work are bound to have emotions bubble up in times of frustration, stress, or disappointment. And expressing those emotions in a safe space is far better for that individual and ultimately for their performance than bottling them up. I was given the message early on in my professional career that crying at work was shameful, would not be tolerated, and made me unprofessional. And I simply feel that is BS. My ability to perform goes hand in hand with how deeply I care. It is very much a package deal. And I think that is true for a lot of individuals. So, it's okay to cry at work. It's okay to get frustrated. It's okay to have those emotions. And I've had the opportunity to have leaders since who would far prefer that I share those frustrations and those emotions with them and work through, whatever is underneath that, than bottle that in and keep it pent up. Last on the personal list, and maybe specifically for anyone who might be struggling, I know how very hard it can be, but do your very best to maintain any self-care you know helps you. And a lot of mental health struggles are cyclical or they ebb and flow. And so, it can be a lot harder than people realize in a time that you're struggling to do some of these basic things that you can do with ease when you're not struggling. So for me, for instance, that includes therapy. I go to therapy once a week. Movement. I try and move my body every day, but at least 5 times a week. That is something that I learned years and years ago, benefits me, not tied to any, physical objective, but really truly benefits my mental health. It's something that can be challenging if I'm struggling, but I really try and set boundaries with myself to not go more than 2 days in a row without doing some sort of physical exercise. Reading. That's something that I really like to do to relax and also to take my mind off whatever might be going on. Getting outside, getting sunlight, spending time in nature. Quiet. This is one that, again, for me can be challenging. I think it's really important from the purpose of regulating your nervous system. But when I'm having a hard time, I tend to want to keep moving because I'm ultimately trying to avoid having to deal with some of the things that I need to deal with. And I think the hardest for me is connection. I tend to isolate myself when I'm having a hard time. And I actually just wrote an article a week or so ago about some reflections on the difference between solitude and isolation. So I'm someone who needs and values solitude. I think that is perfectly fine and maybe even a strength. But when I'm having a hard time from a mental health perspective, that very easily turns into isolation, which actually fuels the challenges that are going on. So I want to switch gears and talk about a couple of topics from a leadership or an organizational perspective. First, I mentioned that tendency toward isolation when I'm having a hard time. And those feelings of isolation can be natural for people with certain mental health challenges. Isolation can also fuel or exacerbate mental health struggles. This is particularly challenging in field service, where we talk often about the fact that technicians are isolated on a day-to-day basis. It's really important for leadership to find ways to help people feel connected to their leaders themselves, their purpose, and their teams. I'll link a podcast in the show notes that we did not too long ago with Zach Mercurio, who authored a book around the power of mattering. While his content is not directly correlated to mental health, there are a lot of intersection points, and he talks about the difference between someone feeling included. So the difference between inclusion and mattering. And I think it's gives some really helpful context. But this idea of looking at, from a leadership and an organizational perspective, how do we keep people connected is really important. The second point I wanted to make here is that mental health should not be a theme that you do something around once a year. Putting a focus on this in May is great as an exclamation mark, but it is not a full sentence. Regular communication, regular efforts, regular initiatives that are personal and programmatic are very, very important. Which leads me to number 3 in this section. The direct leader relationship is crucial. This is where you build trust and psychological safety. That comes from actual, genuine relationships, getting to know people, caring about them as human beings, beyond just how they show up to help the business accomplish its objectives. Many of the experts that we have had on to discuss mental health explain that this employee leadership relationship, building that psychological safety and that trust, that does not come from making mental health a check mark that you talk about in your one-on-ones every time. You don't need to be talking about mental health on a day-to-day basis, but you need to have a close enough relationships with the people that you work with that they will come to you if they're having a hard time. So it's not about weaving it into every conversation or putting it on a schedule. It's about being a safe place for someone to come to share if and when something arises that they're having a hard time with. Number four in this section is I think it's important to acknowledge that some resources have a stigma or maybe feel unrealistic as actual help. So, a couple of things that come to mind for me are, an employee assistance program. I think there can be a stigma with that sometimes. FMLA, that might feel unrealistic to certain individuals. We had a working session with the Standout community in February, and it was really talking about field force well-being. And we talked through a lot of these topics, and the leaders agreed that some of the historical standard resources that companies have offered maybe aren't cutting it in today's landscape or with what people feel comfortable with today. So getting creative and thinking about what you can offer that people will leverage, or what it is that people need is really important. I've had folks share with me that something like emotional intelligence training wasn't offered in their organization from the standpoint of anything having to do with mental health, but it helped everyone so much, not just in how they interacted with each other at work, but how they interacted in their relationships, and even just how they understood themselves. Another leader shared that they agreed that some of the EAP type things have a bit of a stigma, but they had recently given everyone in their organization a subscription to the Calm app. So there's no right or wrong, and plenty of different examples, but getting creative and understanding, what people would actually use and benefit from. And number five, as much as you can, be proactive. Leaders should certainly know how to respond in a situation, react to a situation where they see that someone is struggling. But the goal should be to avoid that position as much as we can. And like many of the things we talk about on this podcast, they're really simple concepts that just are not executed well in many, many instances. So, having those building those relationships, offering psychological safety, building trust, listening to people. Those things are really simple to say, a lot harder to do, but they matter a whole lot. So that's my list of what I had written down to share with you all. I will list in the show notes some of our earlier episodes where we featured different mental health advocates and experts, as well as some resources for different regions in case it's a topic that you want to do a little bit more digging on, to further your own understanding or to get some inspiration for changes that might be beneficial within your organization. I hope that this more personal approach to this topic this year touches someone. If I could let just one person know that you're not alone, I will have accomplished a feat. And I'm always here to listen, truly. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. So thank you. You can learn more by visiting the home of Unscripted at futureoffieldservice.com. The podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.